and drug counselor. She is a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, ordained by Bishop T.D. Jakes and the Potter's House International. Please help me welcome Reverend Cassandra Gray Harris.
Thank you.
We're thankful to have Reverend Gray with us. We're going to have a different kind of setup during this session. We're going to have more of a dialogue, but I am so thankful that you're here. For those who don't know, Dr. Kylan Gray and Lady Cassandra Gray act as mentors for me, and they have been very influential in helping to push me in areas, and I'm thankful for you. Let's start here. Will you just kind of give people how you got into counseling and all that good stuff, and we'll just start there.
So most of the time as therapists, it starts with us like personally. So just growing up in my house and dealing with a lot of trauma, violence, drugs, and then the neighborhood in which I grew up in, and then watching my mom deal with mental health and feeling helpless. But I remember her coming and talking to me, and instead of being fearful, I was able to talk back to her, and I probably was 10, and she had a nervous breakdown, and just being able to talk and listen, and that was the big thing. She would always say, "You always just listen to me." Then I noticed a lot of my friends, my teenage years, having relationship issues, and they would come and talk, and we would talk about it. And so I kind of bumped into it that way. And then just my own personal journey and being able to discover that God has an answer for all ails, heart, mind, and soul. And so just going into that and then just making a decision, this is what I wanted to do. And then I discovered my name, Pastor Tim, means helper of men. Wow. So, that kind of, they always say God doesn't, we always try to look for purpose, but God formulates purpose and then brings a person. So we're purposed to be here. Yeah.
Well, let's jump right into it. Why do you think, or why is it that Christians have such an issue when it comes to the area or the field of counseling? It seems like that is a major, major stigma that exists in our churches today. Why do you think that is?
I think a lot of times, and sometimes we forget the historical factors, but history shows us that as it relates to mental health, not too many years removed, we were the guinea pigs. So we were used as the experiments, which led to a lot of mistrust in the field. The whole field was established to prove that we were less than. That if you were a certain color, or if you were broad or big or small, the assumption was that your brain was smaller, I couldn't work. So I think historically it comes from a place that wasn't intended to help us. And so I think a lot of times that's something that's passed down from our parents. You don't trust. You don't trust the white man. He's trying to get in your head, or you can't believe them. So I think historically and orally that's something that's kind of passed down. And I think as a culture we've taken that on. And so now we say, you don't talk about what goes on in my house. You sure don't show any feelings about how you feel. You need to keep it moving and don't stop. And if you do, that shows a lack of faith in God. So I think that comes from a historical context. Yeah.
And I think too, even the keep it moving sort of mentality that we have, how is that, obviously it's damaging, but how is that something that you've seen in your area and your expertise? How is that something that has really, really hindered people in their progress in life and things of that nature, just the ignoring certain issues, traumas that you had mentioned?
The biggest thing is just being able to recognize it. And I think a lot of times we've been shamed to be able to acknowledge that there's a weakness, that says something about us, that there's a flaw there. Instead of being able to embrace the good, bad, and ugly. You know, we're taught only to embrace the good because I don't want to look bad in front of anybody else. I also believe the things that we experience, if we don't deal with them, if we don't allow ourselves to release what we've experienced and let it come out here so that it can stand up to us and we can look at it and speak to it. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't allow that to happen. But just being able to find a safe space to do that. You know, if we can find a safe place to lay our heads, then we can rest our minds. So just being able to find that.
So when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the different things where counseling may be needed or therapy may be needed, this is a question that I've always sort of wrestled with. It seems as though there's a thin line between maybe being in a bad mood or being in a low place, and then there being some sort of depression or some sort of issue.
Yeah.
How do we identify when there are areas in our lives where we are not mentally healthy, and what are some of those areas that we should look for and indicators that I need some help?
The biggest, there's three that I want to talk about, 3 areas. The first area will be the depression piece, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The second will be anxiety and being able to deal with anxiety. And then the third one is looking at what we call the root cause, would be looking at trauma or some type of major event that impacts. And the big thing about mental health, and I wanted to make sure that I talk about it, because mental health is comprised of our emotional, our social, and psychological well-being. Okay? It also influences the way we think, and it influences the way we feel. So if it's impacting the way we think and the way we feel, it's also going to impact the way we act, right? And so there's 2 things that we look at for mental health. We try to look to see if there's something organic or something like a physical illness that has happened, or maybe a brain injury. That's one way that we look at depression. So when we are looking at anxiety, I'm looking at the impact of trauma. So we have to do a history to kind of see, looking at developmental, looking at family, looking at taking a historical purview. And then the other one that we look at is the function result of singular or multiple genetic, environmental stressors on trauma on the brain structure. So when we start talking about depression, how can you tell? We're talking about something that has impacted the actual structure of the brain. And a really good example of that would be a child that is in a home that has been sexually assaulted or sexually abused. And now they're an adult, and they've never dealt with the emotion. So throughout the child's life, they've dealt with the echo of the trauma. And I'll give you, for instance, I'm in school and I don't trust anybody. I'm with friends, but I'm only going to let you so far in. So that's the way we act. The way we think is, I'm thinking that this person may be against me. The way I feel is I'm feeling either anxious or extremely sad. And the way we tell a difference if someone is dealing with depression is if it happens over a course of time. So if you tell me for the past 2 weeks I haven't been able to get up, I'm not feeling well, not being able to get dressed, the first thing I would say, let's check it out, make sure there's nothing wrong medically. If medically we can't see that there's something going on, now we need to look a little deeper. And so we do that by taking a look at history. Just like when you go to the doctor, they want to see, okay, did your mama have blood pressure and your granny had blood pressure? Okay, so you're more likely what? To have blood pressure, right? So we want to look emotionally to take a look. Okay, tell me what was going on at home. Was there someone there? Was there, did you hear positive things about yourself? Did you hear a lot of negative? You know, what was that like developmentally while you were growing up? And from there, we can actually see how it has impacted the structure of your brain. So if it's impacted the frontal, then we're talking emotions, right? If it's impacted the midbrain, then we're talking about more of some anxiety types of things. If it's impacted the hindbrain, then we're looking at some physical things. But what we look for is over a course of time.
I think too, and you said something that's really important, in how our brain is impacted, the structure of our brain. And so many times, I don't know if we as Christians, we look at it like that. I've heard people talk about, you know, just think better, just do this, just do that. But I think that's something that we have to consider, that when you talk about depression and anxiety, there's an actual impact on the structure of the brain.
Right.
But with that being said, as a Christian, how do we deal with the reality of medication? That's something that, you know, as a pastor, I counsel with people, and we will go to the doctor for physical issues, and we'll take the ibuprofen, we'll take the Tylenol. But in your field, there are often times where you are prescribing medicine. I know in the church, that's a difficult one, because we believe come to church, shout your way through it, and you'll be okay. Speak to that issue in terms of the medicine.
I think it's important when we start talking about, we talk about the brain structure, it's important to recognize that in here is a bunch of chemicals that is in charge of us. One is dopamine. It helps us to kind of remain calm. Serotonin, that's what we use to kind of help us to relax to and be asleep, to rest. And the other one is oxytocin. So when you look at, when we talk about rewiring and the brain restructuring, if there's a trauma that has happened and it's impacted us in our emotional structure, then it's going to impact the dopamine. And when we talk about restructure, we're talking the dopamine levels will be lowered if there's not something to help raise them up. So we look naturally, we look at some natural remedies to see if we can't help that. But if we can't, in order to get that balance, and the body struggles to stay in balance. The body wants to remain static. It wants to be in balance. And so that's the whole goal. It's fighting to stay in balance. So it's trying to, what do I release? Do I release dopamine, or do I release serotonin, or do I release oxytocin? You know, what do I release in the body, in the mind? And so when we talk about medication, and it's why we probably need to make sure we're with the culturally competent therapist and a culturally competent doctor that can rule out any medical issues before we make prescriptions for individuals, so that we can just kind of see what is it really? Is there something we can do naturally to help raise that dopamine level? Is there something that we can do naturally to help raise that serotonin level? What is it that we can actually put into place to be able to help that individual? One of the things that we put together, and it's, I don't know how the PowerPoint is running or if it is going, I don't know for sure, but it's a little thing, it's called Healing Tools. And the goal is to be able to take a look to see how I need to heal. So if we know that the brain in itself is the control center of the entire body, it controls everything. The brain controls whether you breathe. The brain controls whether you move. The brain is in control of everything. So if the brain is impaired, right, by trauma, by something emotionally, by something spiritually, then we have to be able to renew that mind to show it how to renew in a way that's going to help raise the levels necessary so that you can feel better. Does that make sense? Yeah, so the healing tools we have is we try to look at physical, making sure you're taking care of yourself physically. Nutrition and sleep is important. Exercise is important. That's the way to raise those endorphins. That's the way to raise those levels naturally. When we fall in love, you know, most people think it's, I'm in love with this person. But really there's a chemical that is released a set of chemicals that's released. There's serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. And if I was to look at them on a level, put them on a level, when I fall in love.
So there's a love chemical.
There's a love chemical.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and what happens is the love chemical, if say there's 3 things here, it just kind of stays leveled out. All of them are raised. And you're in love. And it lasts for about a year and a half,
So
that in-love experience.
That when you fall in love, there's a chemical.
There's a chemical that is released. It's from the pleasure zone. It's from the pleasure area.
That.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I'm going to work with that. Okay.
Yeah, and the chemical that you're looking for is called oxytocin. That's the one. So when we kiss, there's a chemical that's released. When we embrace, there's a chemical that's released, right? And then don't put it with pheromones, because that's a whole nother talk show. But it's important that you understand we're made up chemically. This body is a I say it's a science project within itself, because keeping it together takes a whole lot, you know. But we use spiritual care, we use lifestyle, making sure we check your lifestyle. Then we use mental health and making sure we're working on the thinking, because the thinking is what impacts everything else. That's where things are released or held. They're either released or held. If we hold on to them, we have what I call it a cumulative bondage. A cumulative bondage is when I just keep stuffing my emotions, and I pretend like they're not there, and I stuff them. Most of the time, if I don't cope or deal with them, they're going to catch up with me. A good time for women and for men is at the midlife. People call it midlife crisis. But it's really, all those emotions are officially catching up with you that you've stuffed and haven't dealt with. And so now it's playing out chemically, because the way you think impacts the way you feel, impacts what you do, right? Yeah.
So there's a person in here, and let's say they're dealing with a trauma, or they're dealing with depression or depressive conditions. And their question is, I know that something's wrong. I'm in church, I'm saved. What do I do next? I think that's, if anything, I hear that the most. And as you know, I often refer to creative spirits, because as a pastor, I believe that there's a level that God has gifted me to speak to, and then there's a level that I need to pass it on to people that are culturally competent. I like that. But for that person in the room right now, what would be your advice? That I know that something's off, I know that something's wrong. What do I do now?
So recognition is the biggest thing. That's half the battle to me, to be able to recognize it. And let's kind of go scripturally. Is that okay if we go scripturally? Okay, so there's a scripture, Genesis, the 1st chapter, verses 2 and 3. It says, "Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of the Lord was hovering over the waters. And then God said." So God spoke to chaos, and chaos became peaceful. Anytime you see that Christ, in the Bible, he was going to heal, he spoke to the demonic. He spoke to the lame man. He spoke to the blind man. He says in his word, "Take my yoke upon me and learn of me." So part of learning about Christ is learning the power of the spoken word. And if we're made truly in his image, the word that is spoken in our lives, about our lives, over our lives is important. That's the way chaos becomes calm. And so when we have to find them, we recognize it, and then find that safe space so that I can be honest about me. A place where I don't have to be naked and keep covering myself up with fig leaves and pretending like everything is okay. We are the greatest pretenders in the whole wide world. And that's because we have been taught that if I show weakness, then somebody may think I'm not this, I don't have it all together. Instead of recognizing in order to have it all together, I need to deal with that. I need to deal with the impact that that has had on my life. So that's the first scripture. The other one is, consequently, and this is Romans 10:17-18, says, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. But I want to I want to break that down just a little bit. It says, faith comes by hearing. We hear ourselves more than we hear the word of God. And so what happens is we develop what we call core beliefs. So the core belief is, I believe God can take care of this for me. I believe that God can take care of my sister. I'm going to come in and pray for your sister. But then I walk out and say, and my core is, God can do that for everybody but me. Because if he really sees me, and he sees this ick that I have that I'm dealing with, some kind of way we think God will treat us the way the world does, that he's going to throw us away. But he says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. And so we can find rest for our souls when we come to God, and then understand that God has established some people in the earth that can handle what you're going through and help you to be able to work through it.
Whew. Let me switch gears here for those who are parents, and this is again another passion of mine, because it seems as though sort of the knee-jerk reaction, especially I see it in public schools with young, kids of color, is that when there is an issue, a behavioral issue, they're immediately recommended Ritalin and other drugs. How do we as parents sort of, again, distinguish between mental health issues in a child and then maybe just a child being a child? And that's one that, again, as a pastor, I get that a lot. And it seems as though these days people are so quickly saying, okay, my child has this issue, and I don't know. And I think that's another area that we need some more clarity in.
It's important, and I believe, and this is Cassandra Grayism, 100. But I believe it's important for us, one, to be able to know the risk factors. Let me just kind of give you some risk factors, because this is, to me, one of the most important things that we can do to help to identify what the risks are. And what risk factors does, it doesn't say you're doomed because you have these risks. It just helps you to see what are some of the factors in my child's life that can lead to some behavioral issues, right? So let me just read a couple of them to you. One is difficult temperament. That's one. Low self-esteem. Impaired cognitively, like during the developmental stages. Do I see that my child is my child behind? If so, what's going on? Or the biggest diagnosis for our children, because you talk about Ritalin, is ADHD. And usually when people start using the alphabet soup on us, we think as parents we have failed. So what we see a lot of times is the parent says, I'm not bringing my kid in so that you can go through my house and say what's been going on. Risk factors. Has the family been in disharmony? Has there been some recent breakups? Was there some domestic violence? Have you moved lately? Has there been different people in the child's life? Has there been some consistency or inconsistency? So we want to take a look at risk factors, because in us as adults, we say, I got to keep it moving. And we think our kids can keep it moving too, not recognizing that impacts their thinking, right? If I'm not safe at home, if I'm made to deal with the adult issues at home, worrying about how we're going to eat, where we're going to sleep, all of that has impact. But we expect our kids to be okay and to be able to go to school and be okay, when as adults we have difficulty dealing with it. And so just being honest and saying, you know what, this has been part of our narrative. And so in order for that to change, we give a holistic approach for care. Does that make sense? The ADHD piece, I will say this, and I've been diagnosed ADHD my entire life. And for a while, I really felt a lot of shame, to have alphabets behind my name, and it wasn't a professional alphabet. But what I've come to understand is attention deficit, that's the negative connotation for it. But really, a person that's ADHD, they can think on a speed level that is incomparable to a singularly focused person. For instance, I can have 10 conversations at one time and never miss a beat with the conversation. My husband, he's singularly focused. He has to stick with you with one conversation. And once you finish that conversation, then he's ready for the next. But I can be at this first conversation, at the end of the next conversation, and in the middle of another conversation, and it's okay. So when
That's what that is. All right.
Yeah.
Man, I'm getting counseling now.
Right. So when we see that, and what happens is people try to take that away from your child. And so there comes the problem. But what we have to do is we have to be able to look at what not only risk, but what are the protective factors that can help this person to still be authentically them and discover that that is the way they learn. I remember in high school, my notebook would stay so cluttered. Like, they would give me my assignment, and I'd stuff it in my notebook, and they'd give me my assignment, I'd stuff it in my notebook, and my neighbor over here, their notebook was so neat and so nice and well packaged. And I would, get in trouble because when she gets ready to grade my notebook, of course, everything is in there, it's just stuffed in there. And if you ask me where something is, I could pull it out for you. Okay? But I was graded because of the order of the notebook and not the content. Our kids are graded not on the content of their mind, but the way the brain orders it. And so what we try to do is we try to instruct families, your child is not deficit. Do not use that ADHD as an excuse. Well, he's ADHD, so he needs to take his medication. He's ADHD, she's ADHD. Let's sit down with her and see how her brain is operating. Most of the time, ADHD kids are advanced. And it becomes a behavioral issue because they're bored in the classroom and can't sit there. And so, they keep getting in trouble, and it's not that they're troubled kids. It's just that nobody has taken the time to see the way they learn, and that's important.
Let's take that same thought, that same principle, and come back to church.
Okay.
How do we as Christians, brothers and sisters, who have people in our congregations that may be going through different mental health challenges, how can we be better at handling, at praying with, at dealing with, in relationship with our brothers and sisters that may be in that place? Because I see that sometimes when we don't know how to deal with something, we isolate them. Mm-hmm. So how can we as pastors, as congregants, how can we do a better job of loving on, facilitating, and helping our brothers and sisters that may be struggling?
So, the one thing that we can look at is how Christ modeled that for us. He wasn't intimidated by anybody. I mean, he dealt with the demoniac, and he dealt with the people that had illness, somebody that had messed up mind and messed up brain. He didn't label them and say that. He dealt with the malady, but he loves the person. And I think as a church, we have to be able to separate the malady from the person. But if we see somebody, we'll label the person and say, oh God, here comes crazy Cassandra. Let me just get on over here and get out of the way. Instead of saying, sometimes her thinking may get in her way, or she may bump into herself at times. And I think the church needs to recognize that the first place that our people are going to come is the church. The first place that we're going to look for help is the church and through the leadership. So being able to be open to that and no longer stigmatizing people and putting people in categories and feel like you got to handle them differently. So I think that's important for the church. Making just a personal commitment, and that's everybody in church, that I am going to try to learn a little bit more about a particular disorder. If it's depression, what is that about? You know, we get frustrated with our congregants because they can't get up off the couch. Well, if they've been there for months on the couch, can't get up, can't get dressed, can't comb my hair, can't brush my teeth, and you see that getting worse over time, that means dopamine is all the way out, right? Almost on empty. We at least need to raise it to half full. So if I can't get up and move around, I'm not using my spiritual tools, I'm not using some things that's going to help me, then I will need to look at medication. It doesn't mean medication's all long term. We can do short-term medication until we can get up off the couch, and then we can start utilizing it in ways.
You said something that it's critical to me, and I hadn't even thought about it like that. But there are so many terms that we hear that we really don't know what it is, what it means. And I think as a church, as I'm hearing you speak, we can do a better job of educating ourselves, our members, on what is anxiety, what is depression, what is this, or what is that. And I think that needs to become a regular part of sort of what we're teaching people.
Yeah.
I think that's a major. I don't know if that's something that we need to look at all churches and do.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
That's amazing.
Putting a toolbox together for our churches so that you'll be able to know that person that comes in that's dealing with anxiety, and we know them, they're all in our families and they're in our, we're all in our churches, especially if we're dealing with anxiety or something. And so this is a mother, she's dealing with her child. She comes in and she talks to you, Pastor Tim, and she says, I'm dealing with my son, he's doing XYZ, I don't know how I can help him, I'm not quite sure. And so you all pray together, you put a plan together, and then, half a day later, she's calling you back. And usually, this person, when she comes around, she's dealing with it, she's on 10. So if I go from 0 to 10, like my kid crossed the road wrong and I'm at 10. My kid's running in church and I'm at 10. And a 10 is, I'm spanking his butt, I'm whooping him, I'm snatching him up because he ran in church. Do you know what I'm saying? So when the kid runs across the street, there's no safety factor because my voice has always been on 10, right? And so sometimes we're conditioning them. So we have to learn how to uncondition. That's that renewing of the mind, right? So we have to show them how to stop conditioning that behavior in order for it to change. The person is dealing with anxiety, which lets me know this person has dealt with some trauma, right? And now she's raising the anxiety in her son or daughter based upon her reaction to them. That raises the anxiety level. That's kind of an example. So if that person would present in therapy, one, we would work with the parent on the anxiety and help them to deal with that so they don't deal with everything on 10. If I'm dealing with everything on 10, that means I've stuffed everything in my life, and now everything to me traumatic seems like a trauma. And so when a small thing happens, I'm still dealing with it like it's a major trauma. We call that's like a trauma echo. So it's not the same trauma, but the emotions feel the same, right? And so I'm going to cope as though it's the same. Does that make sense? As the church, we have to, be able to come together and understand, that it's when we're dealing with mental health, it's a complexity. It's complex, but it's also easy. But it's just coming to be able to, one, recognize it and acknowledge it so that we can change it.
Are you enjoying Reverend Gray? Lord have mercy. Listen, we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. As you can hear, she is, again, a wealth of knowledge. And there may be someone here that has questions that we haven't covered. So you can come down to one of the microphones here and ask your question as we continue on in the conversation. But how many can say that this session, in some way, shape, or form, applies to you? How many can say whether it's a family member, whether it's maybe it's yourself? I'll tell you, there's some things that she's even said that I hadn't even looked at it like that, with the dopamine and the different levels and how we look at medication. That's phenomenal. So if you have questions, if you'll come down now.
Yeah, my question is, as being a pastor, how do you come to someone and talk to it and let them know, or that you recognize that it's more than, just that it is a mental issue? How do you kind of approach that, and without injuring them or making it where it's more of a problem? How would you kind of approach something like that?
I think forums like this for our congregations is a real good first step, because for us, this is not something we openly talk about. And me having a problem, that's definitely not something we would talk about. That's one way. And then the other way is being reflective about your own life. I struggled with such, or my family struggled with such, and I recognized I needed a little bit more help. So just being open just about ourselves as leaders, and no longer taking ourselves out of the Me Too movement, but inserting ourselves in. Me too. I was dealing with stuff too. This is a safe place. Me too. I was dealing with some anxiety, and I was coping by smoking. Me too. That was me. I was out there in the streets doing that. Do you see what I'm saying? Me too. I dealt with someone coming in my room in the middle of the night, and it impacted my very soul. I felt like I couldn't find myself. Me too. But it doesn't mean that I'm lost, and it doesn't mean that there's no hope. That's what the enemy wants us to think, that there's no hope because of the marring that we call it, that has happened to us. So just being able to change the narrative, changing our story, even just inserting a little bit of hope changes the narrative. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Were you on Ritalin?
Was I on Ritalin? I was not on Ritalin.
So how do you feel?
I didn't take Ritalin.
I was on Ritalin.
Were you on Ritalin?
I think kindergarten through 10th grade.
Yeah, me too. See, go ahead. That's a me too, right?
Yes.
That's a me too.
Twice a day, morning and afternoon.
Right.
Pray.
Right. So what's your question about Ritalin?
So you don't prescribe it for children. Are you for it or not? That's what I'm asking.
I am for medication management after we've explored everything else.
Okay. Great.
So I am for medication management, but we have to explore everything else. So if I see that you're totally out of control, then I will refer you to my psych. So we have a psychiatrist on staff, and so I refer you to psych. She's a Christian too. And so we work in tandem and not just send you for medication management without talk therapy. Talk therapy is important because that can help you to move forward from medication management. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So my question as a mom and as an educator, you see people who do prescribe medication, and like you said, I don't see a problem with that. It has a place. But my question to you is about brain development, and if there is an effect on brain development with these prescriptions, because a lot of parents are saying, hey, my son's brain isn't fully developed until the age of what, like 20? So how, when I insert these chemicals, how does that affect that? So is there an effect?
Absolutely. Any type of medication you take has a risk. If you take a Tylenol, if you look at the warning on the bottle, it says it can cause kidney damage. I mean, it's a whole lot of different things that it says. So all medications have a risk, but medication also has its place. Why do I say that? Medication is a chemical. It's made up of chemicals that's going to impact the chemical that we already have. A good example, when we talk about serotonin, one of the things that I recommend to parents a lot is to get what we call it for kids that are hyped is to get melatonin, right? That's a natural supplement, and it helps a child to it helps them to calm down and to relax and to rest. It's a natural substance. It's not the Ritalin or the Concerta or any of there's a lot of new meds that's being prescribed, so it doesn't have that in it. And then we take a look to see about lifestyle changes. The way they eat sugar, the way they drink sodas, I mean, chemicals, sugar, caffeine. I mean, all of that is chemicals, and that's going to impact. So Ritalin is not it does have an impact. It can have an impact on a child, but you want to make sure that it's being used for what it needs. If it's used for behavior management only, that is not a reason for Ritalin. But a complete assessment to make sure that's needed, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for balance. Remember that, like the balance. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, and we'll go to the next question right after this question, but you said talk therapy, and it made me think there are so many different approaches to therapy and counseling. Can you just speak quickly to those different areas? You know, for instance, talk therapy or whatever other ways and means that you do counseling.
So as therapists, in our toolbox, we have what we call different theories, right? And so the different theories gives us the approach that we're going to use. And so when as we're looking at now evidence-based theories that can help with the behavior that the person is dealing with. So if we're talking ADHD, we're going to help with behavior management. So we're going to use what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral is where we want you to have some real time between your thinking, your cognitive process, and your behavior. And so the different things we would give you to do to help manage your behavior, we'll start giving you things that we want you to implement in the home. And sometimes we augment that with medication, and then when we get the behavior that we need, if we can see that that person can move on from that and can naturally generate what's needed from the meds, then we can do that. Does that answer? Okay.
Hi, Dr. Gray. My question is, as a grandparent of elementary school kids and as a former CPS worker, I don't know if you're aware, but in Jefferson County, if a child is recommended for mental services and is prescribed medication, if you refuse to give the child that medication, you feel like your child doesn't need it, you can have someone, like I used to be, drag you into court to force you to have the child take the medicine, at least when they're in school. What can we do as a community to kind of turn that around? I understand some kids need medication and some parents, for whatever reason, don't want to give them to them. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about someone who's worked with someone like you, and we found other ways to do things, but the school system basically just wants to take the easy way out and give them a pill so they'll sit there and be quiet.
Yeah. So in that instance, you would want to comply. Where you do have your power is who you choose to send your child to. So, and that's the one thing that we need to understand. I'm not just going to send them to somebody that's just going to write a prescript. If you've only spent 10 minutes with this child and now you're writing a prescription, something's wrong with that picture, because there's a whole set of things that needs to be evaluated. The developmental piece is important. To take a look at the cognitive behavior that's important, looking at the familiar, the family, looking at the strengths of the family. There's a whole lot of things that need to be looked at. And so the reason I'm excited about this is because culturally, we've not added our culture into anything as it relates to mental health. But that narrative is changing, because you have more African American therapists that are pushing for, we want to see the ACEs score. We already know our ACEs score is off the Richter scale. Okay, so now we can come in and do something to help intervene with our families and do it in a culturally competent way. And that's your draw. You ask your doctor, are you culturally competent? Have you had some cultural training in dealing with our kids? If you have not, can you recommend someone to me that is familiar with our culture? Because I'm not taking your pills anymore unless I can see there's a real need for it. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question about bipolar disorder.
Okay.
I know in the Black community it goes undiagnosed a lot. Are there varying degrees to bipolar disorder? How do you know when an individual needs medicine, when they don't, especially when people that are bipolar tend to not want to need medicine?
Right.
So what advice can you give, and can you describe, are there levels to it and how that goes? Thank you.
So bipolar, so when you look at on the spectrum, so a person with bipolar is someone that's high today and low tomorrow. And it can be on the extreme. I had a couple clients, well, I have several clients that dealing with bipolar. One of my clients, hers is when it's manic-y, like a manic, so you go from just kind of being anxious to total manic. And that's that person's way of coping with whatever stressor has hit them, right? And so if we're talking chemically, because most time with bipolar we're talking chemically, I'm gone to a manic disorder because there's no balance in the three chemicals, right? If there's no balance in the chemicals, then my anxiety is going to be to the roof. When my anxiety goes to the roof, it overrides my judgment and causes me to behave in ways that I wouldn't normally behave. Okay, so when I'm looking at it in a manic state, that means I'm shopping and I know I ain't got no money. I done ran up every credit card in the house, or I'm gambling, or I'm using, or I'm having sex with people that I, wouldn't normally have. That behavior becomes my values and my morals. I know what those are, but when I'm in a manic state, my judgment it's overrun, right? And because of that, I'm acting in ways that's not normally me. That's the manic state. And then we have what we call the other side of the spectrum, which is the depression state. I'm a bubbly person. I enjoy getting out and doing things, and I'm flatline. I can't get up. I can't function. And when we start looking at when should we address it, is when it happens over a period of time. I tell people, look, 2 to 4 weeks. If a person is doing this in 2 to 4 weeks and it still continues, it's time to really take a look at that. So if it's your girlfriend, girl, I noticed some things is going on. Do we need to talk? Can we sit down and talk? Can I tell you what I'm seeing in you? That's when we use the accountability, the accountable partners. As the body of Christ, we're accountable to one another. And if I see that, I need to tell you, this is what, I'm not trying to talk about you. This is what I'm seeing, So what can we do? I'm here to help you. I'm here. I'll go with you wherever you want to do. I'm with you on that. Did that answer your question? So today, what's different is we can do what we call genetic testing. So in our office, we do what we call genetic testing. And genetic testing can tell you if you need meds and the type of meds that your body needs to help you to get to a level, to level out. That's today's medication. Isn't that something? And so when we start talking about culturally competent, that's another one of those things that we are aware of that we can make sure is tested. Has my person been tested yet? Because it'll give you a whole list of medications, not just for mental health, for your physical health too. It can give you a whole list of medications that best work with your personal chemical makeup. So my chemical makeup and your chemical makeup, you're ADHD, I'm ADHD. You may have to take Ritalin because of some of the properties in Ritalin that's going to help raise the level of chemicals that you need to function. I may take Concerta, which may be a totally different mix, but that can also help. Does that make sense? So there's not one, two that's the same. And that's been the problem. The problem has been we've been cookie cutted, right? There's been a cookie cut there, and everybody gets the same. And that's when you know that person is not really paying attention to the person that's in front of them. Make them slow down, because you're talking about my mental health. Medication can help with bipolar. It depends upon the chemical makeup. So I can't say generally prescribe. I can say that that person needs to present, be evaluated by the medical doctor, mental health, make sure there's a complete, real good evaluation that's done. And when I say evaluation, you want to look at history, family, you want to look at developmentally. Developments can help us so much to be able to know if that person has dealt with the trauma at an early age. That means everything that was normally going this way has now gone this way, right? And so now it's almost like fragments of emotions everywhere. And so this person is constantly trying to pull those emotions back in, right? Which can create a look of bipolar, but really you've dealt with some trauma, and now we're dealing with PTSD and not bipolar disorder. Most of our people, we don't know. It's one thing that we haven't discovered that we're discovering now is most of us is trauma. Most of us, we have dealt, and it's unresolved trauma. From our neighborhoods, just witnessing death, witnessing somebody get shot. I was dealing with a couple teens. He said, all my friends are dead. I'm not expected. He's 17. I'm not expected to make it. But he gets up and goes to school every day, and he's scared his name's going to go on the hit list. You know, so that's trauma, right? That's trauma to the nth degree. Okay, so if he acts out behaviorally at school, he's going to get suspended, but nobody identifies the trauma, the cause, right? And so there's a lot of root causes that we have, but we have to be honest. You know, I live in a high-risk neighborhood. I need to make sure my kid is okay, that he's not fearful and carrying a fear around, because that's going to impact his thinking and his feeling. And if it impacts those two things, it's definitely going to impact his behavior. We see a change. He's running around with gang people, and now he's drinking and smoking. Well, we haven't addressed the trauma. He is. He's medically managing himself. He's medically managing himself. And because we've not identified it, and so we're trying to figure out, so now you're trying to take this away from him, and he's like, why are you trying to take away something that's helping me to cope? I feel normal right here. So that's, I mean, we have to be able to be open to address what our kids and what we have experienced, not just our kids, what we have experienced, and the impact that it's had on our thinking and our feelings, because it's definitely going to impact our behavior.
I'd like to say, first of all, I'm just really enjoying this. I could listen to you all day. But I kind of have a two-part question. I am one that has dealt with depression in my life. I have never had to be on medication because you mentioned before that we talk to ourselves. Like, not only do we hear what's going on the outside, but we mainly talk to ourselves. So it's in our head what we're saying to ourselves. And I say that because I was able to bring myself out of depression because I had a mother that was there for me, that talked positive to me all the time when I was young. It's funny, you mentioned a lot of things, because she has talked to me even when back from the age of like 9 and 10 years old. And she would say things to me, and at the time I was like, why is she saying this to me? And I mean, I don't really understand what she's saying. But I lost my mother at a young age, and that threw me into depression, which is what you were talking about, things of trauma that happened to us. She died just abruptly. She went into the hospital because my dad was in the hospital. She was there helping him, and she had a massive stroke there and went into a coma and never came out. I lost her. So I went through a lot of depression over that. My question is, I noticed that I had a lot of physical ailments, like I stayed in pain all the time. And you mentioned oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin as the three chemicals that are, produced in our brain. My question is, what's the correlation with pain and depression? Because we see a lot of times like homeless people that, they're just laying around, basically have no energy. I went through that, a time where I just didn't want to do anything. Days that I just didn't get up out of the bed. I didn't want to, I didn't. Physically, I just couldn't do it. What's the correlation with pain and depression? And then the second question I have is, as far as oxytocin, we can produce that in our brain to make us feel better. Thank God. He does give us everything we need. We are supplied with everything that we need. So the second part is, what are some of the things that we can do as far as nutritionally to get some of these levels up that you've mentioned and make ourselves feel better and not have to, because I was blessed not to be able to have to take medication. But what are some things that we can eat, that we can add to our diets that can help us keep those levels up and kind of help in that way without medication?
One, I will tell you what you just described to me is what we call complicated grief. Okay? So, were you diagnosed with depression?
No, ma'am.
Yeah. So, you're dealing with complicated grief. Young person, my parent passed away, and complicated grief is I'm dealing with the grief, the result from that over years. It has impacted my life over the span of years. And so when we talk about complicated grief, that's a little different. When we talk about depression, it can lead to depression. But when we talk about complicated grief, that means when we talk about grief, we're looking at stages. Like first there's shock, denial, I can't believe it. The shoulda, woulda, couldas, I should have done something different. I wish I'd have went there. I wish it was me and not them. We go through that part. Then there's the anger. And a lot of times we're stuck in the anger process. The anger, between anger and the depression as a result of our loved one gone. And so we cannot come past those two things. And so it starts to complicate our lives. You ask about the medical aspect of that. So depression is not just, I can't get off the couch. Depression is, my heart hurts. I have pains in my neck. I have pains in my back. Depression does manifest physically as well as mentally. So it does manifest. Some people can't open things. It can manifest different ways. Headache is a great example. Just have an extreme headache. We label them migraine headaches, right? But usually it's because something is depleted. Something is depleted. Something that we need chemically has been depleted. So I take that pill to bring that back, right? Right. Does that help? Okay.
We got time for one more question, and then we're going to move on to the next phase.
Thank you for coming, and forgive me if you've already mentioned this. I did tip out to use the restroom, but in terms of ADHD, recently I feel as if that's something that I've struggled with mildly, even as a child. And so I'm wondering if you have any either resources or recommendations about potentially natural remedies that you may, that I could be able to use for it, just for focusing and completing tasks. And
there's a lot. I try not to prescribe in that way without sitting down and talking and doing a really good history with you, because I would want to see how is it presenting a risk to you, or is it now part of a risk and protective factors for you? There may be parts of it that you want to hang on to.
Right, absolutely.
So that would determine what you would take.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. It could just be a fix of changing my lifestyle, changing what I eat. I think she asked about nutrition. I always recommend a really good nutritionist, someone that believes in herbal medicine too as well.
Right.
That's important. The new craze right now for us with mental health is what CBD, what kind of impact that's going to have in the mental health field, because it's really going to take hold, and I really believe a lot of the meds they're prescribing. So just making sure before you take anything that you get a really good history. You can do that with your medical doctor.
Right.
You know, go in and say, hey, I feel like I've been struggling. And then before they write the prescript, make sure he's got your history down so he can give you something that is going to benefit you. Ask for the Gen X test. Y'all can ask for that genetic test. You can only get it one time through your medical doctor, but you can ask for that test because that would show you what types of med your body chemicals need.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much.
Let's put our hands together for Reverend Gray. Has this not been phenomenal? Come on, let's stand to our feet and thank God for her. She has blessed us on today.
Thank you.
Listen, she has a table. She has a table in the lobby with all kinds of information. You heard me mention this before, that I often refer to Creative Spirits because I know that she and Dr. Gray are anointed, they're knowledgeable, they're gifted, and I'm telling you, this is someone that if you know, not simply because of trauma, but also it may be that you just need to connect with someone.
Absolutely.
And just have someone to talk to. She is phenomenal. So again, thank God for her. Our coordinator is going to come, our conference coordinator is going to come, and then she's going to give instructions, and then we're going to pass it on to Pastor Anderson and take a quick break. So if you'll come, give us the instructions first, and then Pastor Anderson.
Tim, can I give a quick exercise that everybody can use?
Absolutely.
I want to give everybody an exercise that you can use. Is that okay? All right. One of the things that God has given us naturally is the breath, right? With the breath, his word says that when he breathed into the nostrils of man, man became what? A living soul. So our lifeline is tied to the breath. Right? And a lot of times when we're dealing with depression or anxiety or trauma, most of the time the breath gets caught. Like you may not even recognize, but I want you to put your hands on your stomach, and I want you to take a really good deep breath in, and then I want you to let it all the way out, and then watch your stomach just totally relax. You feel that relaxation? Do it one more time. Take a deep breath in, hold it, now let it all the way out, blow. All the way out. Do you feel your stomach releasing from the tension? Yeah, so a lot of times what we don't understand, the breath is very important. And a lot of times our breath is stagnated through our body. Like it cannot give a proper flow, which it can't give you the proper nutrients that you need. Some people that don't get enough air, it messes with the mind here, and you can't get clarity. You have some people that at night they have to sleep with the mask on so that they can stay oxidized throughout the night. Yeah, that's because the body is not breathing the air properly, right? And so one of the things that we work on, and I have a book, it's called 90 Days of Power. We introduce what we call, it's a part of DBT. It's one of our theories that we use, and it's using meditation and breathing and using what we call mindfulness. And what mindfulness does is it helps you to bring your mind into a focus. Our mind is always moving, thinking. But if you just take 5 minutes a day, stop for a moment, pause, put your hand on your stomach, and concentrate on nothing but your breath. Just for 5 minutes. And follow the breath. And follow the breath. When you do that, when you practice that, you just moved your mind from a stressful state and brought it into one point, one focus point. And I tell you to concentrate on the breath because that's where a living soul is. That's where life is. Breath is important. So take in a moment. If you do 5 minutes a day, it reduces stress. It can reduce heart, mind issues, make you think clear. You just sit and just breathe and concentrate on the breath. When I'm with my kids, I give them chewy candies, And I say, just concentrate on that lemon. Can you taste that? And breathe. And they're just concentrate on the lemon. They concentrate on the lemon, and within the next 5 minutes, they've reached a calmness. It brings you to a calmness so that you can think clear. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
At the Answers Conference, you get information and free counseling. Let's put our hands together again for Reverend Gray. Wow, absolutely phenomenal. Please make sure that you see the table out in the lobby. She has all kinds of stuff out there.
What's that, man?
And before we dismiss for lunch, we do have a midday refreshment.
There we go.
That right there was powerful because I truly followed the breath and what that did for me in that moment. We have Pastor Tim Anderson here. He is going to give a brief testimony of his experience with One Body. We're going to pray and we're going to dismiss for a 25-minute lunch. 25 minutes. Free lunch. And then we're going to reconvene here in the sanctuary, okay?
All right. Good afternoon. I want to take a moment. I'm just so honored to be giving an experience of what One Body has meant to me. It is it's the epitome of where the Bible talks about that iron sharpens iron. And the best analogy I can give is just like a sword that has not been sharpened, or it has gotten to where it's coming